The next book I read was This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian. Fuck. The next book I read was This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian. Fuck. The next book I read was This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki. The next book I read was This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki. The next book I read was This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian. The next book I read was This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki. I'm never gonna say that correctly, so we're just gonna move on. Hello, welcome back to I Forgot Salt, the YouTube channel where I talk about things that I like. Today we're going to be doing my March wrap-up, and I think this is the first wrap-up that I've actually done in a timely manner. We're only on April 3rd, so it's a fucking miracle. This month I read 18 books, which is more books that I've read in a month than ever, I think. Even more than last month, which was 16, which was also insane. Gotta spend all of this free time doing something, and apparently I'm spending it reading. Just like January and February, I'm going to start off with some stats, talk a little bit about the numbers related to my reading, and then we'll get into going over each individual book and what I thought of it, what it's about, things like that. I had a really great reading month, and like I said, I read 18 books in the month of March, and of those, I had 2 5-star books, 8 4-star books, which is unbelievable, 8 4 stars, 5 3-star books, 2 2-star books, 0 1-star books, and then 1 unrated book because I don't rate books that I read for school. Breaking it down by genre, I read 5 thrillers, 1 historical, 6 fantasy, and of those fantasy books, 1 was high fantasy, 3 were historical fantasy, and 2 were magical realism. 1 nonfiction book, 2 contemporary books, and 3 graphic novels. Breaking that down by age group, I read 14 adult novels and 4 young adult novels. I originally had 12 books on my TBR for March, something I didn't make a video about, but had a list in my notebook that I had just written down some books I wanted to read. And I ended up reading 10 of those 12 books on my TBR. So that was pretty good. I'm pretty pleased with that. Jumping right in, the first book I read in March was Lock Every Door by Riley Sager, and this was a 4 out of 5 star read for me. This is a thriller novel, a new release thriller novel, I believe, that follows a young woman who has no friends, no family, is very alone in the world, and she takes this dream job to apartment sit at this amazing, very secretive apartment building in New York City filled with very wealthy tenants. But the catch is that there are a lot of rules she has to follow in order to get this amazingly easy job, basically just living in the apartment and getting paid to spend the night there. And of course, as is always the case in thrillers, things are not always what they seem. I really enjoyed this book. It was a fun read, if a little bit predictable, which is why it's a 4 out of 5 stars for me. As engaging as it was to read, I feel like you could kind of pick out from the beginning who was going to be the bad guy. Not necessarily what the ending was, but what the general gist of what was going to happen. And then when the big twist was revealed, I was sort of like, wow, that's pretty cool, but what? So I flew through this book. I really enjoyed it. It was, again, a very, very fun read, but it didn't have me quite on the edge of my seat as things like The Turn of the Key or The Sundown Motel did, but I still really enjoyed it. So 4 out of 5 stars. The next book I read in March was I'm having so much trouble with this. The next book I read in March was Creatures by Chrissy Van Meter, and this was a 4 out of 5 read for me. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and it's funny because I can't really articulate why I enjoyed it. This is a literary fiction novel, so it's very flowery, very artsy, and it sort of follows a young woman who's about to get married, and her fiance has gone missing at sea. They live in a coastal town off the coast of California, and out of the blue, the night before her wedding, her mother, who she has a very bad relationship with, just shows up at her door. That's how the story sort of starts, and then as the book progresses, you get to see different vignettes from her life and how she grew up and as she grows older, and it was just such a beautiful picture of this woman's life all the way from childhood to middle age. And there were a lot of things in this that really resonated with me. It touched me in a way that not a lot of books do and not a lot of books have on a very personal level. So I can definitely say this isn't a book for everyone. It's a little convoluted, it's very flowery, but if you have any interest at all in books that deal with sort of painful family dynamics or questions of parental trauma being passed down to children, things like that, very real, very raw, and very emotional stories, then I think this would be a book to pick up. This was, again, a 4 out of 5 stars. I loved this book, but it is very much not for everyone. The third book I read in March was The Death of Mrs Westaway by Ruth Ware, and this was a 3 out of 5 star read for me. I loved The Turn of the Key. I read that last month, I believe. That was a 5 out of 5 star read for me, and I was very disappointed by this. Not in that it was a bad book, but it just paled so much in comparison to The Turn of the Key that I felt a little bit let down. Essentially, this book follows a young woman who works as a tarot card reader on a pier and who has taken out a loan from a loan shark and has no longer has the ability to pay it back because the interest just keeps getting higher. And suddenly she gets a letter in the mail addressed to her claiming that she is the heir to this grand fortune, but the letter is not meant for her. It is someone else's inheritance, but she decides that she's going to go and accept that inheritance and pretend to be the person the letter was really for so she can have the ability to pay off her debts. And of course, like I said with Lock Every Door, as always in thrillers, things are not always what they seem. Like I said, I enjoyed the book. It's a great mystery, but it just didn't have the impact that The Turn of the Key did. It has a very slow start to the point where I almost kind of forgot I was reading a thriller, and it was just this, oh, will they find out whether she's lying or not, or will everything turn out okay, kind of beginning into middle. And then finally when the twist in the end hits, you're like, oh, that's right, this is supposed to be a thriller. There was stuff going on in the background this whole time that I just went way over my head. I also think the final twist was a little bit convoluted, but that may just be because I had kind of checked out by that point and wasn't paying as much attention to the details as I probably should have been. That being said, again, 3 out of 5 stars is not a bad book. It's a pretty decent mystery. I just wouldn't call it a thriller. I don't know. I really liked it. I just didn't love it. So 3 out of 5 stars, but I still would like to pick up more of Ruth Ware's books in the future. This book is very hard to describe. The fourth book I read in March was A Cosmology of Monsters by Sean Hamill, and this was a 3 out of 5 star read for me. This book essentially follows a young man, basically from his birth to middle age, whose grandmother and father have both been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and his family dealing with the repercussions of that. Right before his father passes away, he develops this obsession with haunted houses based on the monsters that he sees. And the narrator's life basically revolves around those monsters and haunted houses in general. It's like a Lovecraftian romance, if you will. It's very hard to explain because the way that it's written is so beautiful and very sweeping, very romantic, but at the same time, it is a book about someone who feels like they are broken and a family who has been completely broken. It is very, very sad. It deals a lot with, again, themes of schizophrenia, mental illness, depression, suicide. There's a character who faces a lot of homophobia because this novel takes place in the 80s, and there is also a borderline problematic relationship in this where an older woman grooms a young boy. There is quite a long list of trigger warnings, but that being said, it's a very striking story. It took me kind of a long time to get through. It took me a couple of days just because it was very dense in its prose, but it was beautifully written. It's a very well done Lovecraftian romance. For what it is phenomenally done. That being said, I would not consider this horror, even though I believe it is marketed as horror. I also would not recommend this book to anyone who, again, like Creatures, doesn't have a real vested interest in literary fiction or in very flowery purple prose as a style of writing. It's not very accessible, but if you are into that, it's very beautiful. The next book I read in March was Bloom by Kevin Panetta and Savannah Ganuccio, and this was a 4 out of 5 star read for me. This is actually a graphic novel, The story centers on a boy in his late teens living on a coastal town in Maryland whose parents own a bakery and whose sister has just gotten married and moved away from home. He is his parents' only employee in the bakery, so they need him there to help out, basically. But he wants to move to Baltimore with his band to try to make a name for themselves. The story is marketed as a romance, but I think the romance that forms between the two boys in the story takes a real backseat to Ari's personal journey, him discovering what it is that he wants out of life, discovering what makes him happy, admitting to himself that he is allowed to do what makes him happy. Because really, the romance came about very late in the book and there wasn't much to it. So I would consider this more of like a coming-of-age story than any sort of romance graphic novel. That being said, this was adorable. I really, really loved this, and I really identified a lot with Ari's journey into figuring out who he wanted to be as he grew up, especially the fact that he felt a lot of insecurities in not going to college immediately after high school, and that's something I can really relate to. And the art style is absolutely adorable. It is so well done, and I love the fact that the entire book is done in shades of blue as opposed to being full color. It really gives the story a very specific atmosphere. I really enjoyed this. I really recommend it if you're interested at all in like YA contemporary graphic novels. The next book I read was My Lady Jane by a trio of women who call themselves the Lady Janies, but whose actual names are Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jody Meadows. And this was a 5 out of 5 star read for me. This was so outside my comfort zone. It is a YA historical magical realism romance. That's a mouthful. And none of those genres are genres that I would normally reach for and pick up. This book is essentially a magical realism retelling of the Lady Jane Grey's story, who is a historical figure from, I'm gonna say, 17th century England, who was crowned queen and reigned for 9 days before being executed. And this is a retelling of her story. This was hilarious. I loved it so much. I loved the romances in it. I loved the characters. The humor was spot on. I was literally laughing out loud sitting outside Starbucks while I was reading this. This was a masterpiece for anyone who isn't normally into like the rom-com genre. It was a good time. It was genuinely a fun book to read, and I'm really excited to continue on with this series. Each book in this series is a retelling of a famous figure in history or literature with a sort of magical realism twist. This one, it was just so good. The third book in the series, I believe, is coming out in June, and I am 100% going to be picking that up. The next book I read in March was The Sundown Motel by Simone St. James, and this was a 4 out of 5 stars. This was a genuine thriller. I loved this book. This essentially follows a young woman who moves to small town New York searching after her aunt who disappeared in, I believe, the 1980s working at this roadside motel. So the young girl in the modern day gets the same job that her aunt had when she disappeared and begins working at the Sundown Motel. It follows dual timelines from the aunt's perspective in the 1980s as well as the young girl in the modern day, and it was so well done. I did enjoy the parts of the book that were set in the 1980s a lot more than the present day parts, just because I found the girl's aunt, that character, to be a lot more interesting, engaging, and I just liked her a lot more than her niece. And the niece also had a weird obsession with losing her virginity that just sort of got on my nerves really fast. But, oh my gosh, this was so well done, and it was genuinely scary. Like, I was reading it at night, for the first night that I read it, and I had to stop because I was getting really freaked out, and I picked it back up the next morning when it was light outside and things weren't so real. But if you are looking for a really good horror thriller, this is 100% it. It was fast-paced, it was engaging, it was just so well done. This was a true thriller, and I was really happy that I picked it up. The next book I read was The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle, and this was a 4 out of 5 star read for me. This book is another Lovecraftian-esque horror book. This one actually set in the 1920s. It's historical magical realism. Historical horror?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
It's actually a novella. It's very, very short. And it follows a young man who is a courier for people who work in the occult underground of 1920s New York City, and just goes about his jobs without asking questions, except for one day when he interferes in something he should not have. I can't say much more about it just because it is a very short novel, but I can say that this is, more than anything, it is a well-written story. It is a well-told story. The plot is very concise. The characters are very fleshed out in spite of the story's short length, and I just felt that this was the perfect example of a well-done novella. I really, really loved this. The only reason it's a 4 out of 5 instead of a 5 out of 5 for me is because I feel like I want more. I wanted this to be a full-length novel. Yes, the story was perfectly well-paced and perfectly well laid out for the size of a novella, but the world that was built in this could have been an entire fantasy book series. And I wanted that. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know the intricacies of the city that exists under New York City. And I'll admit, I was a little bit disappointed when it ended. I highly recommend this book for anyone who is really interested in getting into Lovecraftian horror but doesn't necessarily want to touch Lovecraft's original works. It pulls directly from Lovecraft's original stories without getting too purpley, if that makes sense. And because it does pull from the original works, it is a quote-unquote faithful adaptation of the mythos, more so than Lovecraftian-inspired works like A Cosmology of Monsters. And I don't know, it was a really great addition to the genre, and it was a really, really well-done story, and I highly recommend it. The next book I read in March was Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames, and this was a 4 out of 5 stars. This was actually my first high fantasy read since maybe elementary school, and I had such a fun time reading this. If I could describe this book in one word, it's I love my wife and I want to go home, but I gotta kill this guy. The book. It's a high fantasy story that follows a bunch of dudes in their 60s who used to be, in their youth, this really amazing, feared group of mercenaries. But, you know, as they got older, they split apart, they settled down, they started families, and then one member of the band, his daughter goes missing, and so he gets the band back together in order to go find her. It was admittedly a little bit of a slow start and a little bit confusing at first, but I don't think that was the fault of the book. I think that was on me having zero context for how high fantasy stories work and having no context for a lot of the things mentioned in this, like chimeras and griffins and tree ants and things like that, like D&D-esque monsters that I was literally Googling on my phone to get a picture of in my head. So for somebody who's really interested in high fantasy, especially like grimdark or dark comedy high fantasy, I feel like this is a must read. So it is a trilogy, and the sequel to this book is already out, and the third book is coming out this year, I believe. So I'll definitely be picking those up. I don't know. I mean, I flew through this in a single day, which is unbelievable. I loved it. I don't know if I'll be getting into high fantasy as much as I would like. I think I'm still going to be very picky about what I read and stick more to the magical realism side of fantasy for now, but this has definitely opened up a whole new genre of books for me, and I'm really excited about that. The next book I read was No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai and illustrated by Junji Ito, and this is a manga adaptation of the Japanese classic novel No Longer Human. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I enjoyed it mostly for the art. The story is very, very, very dark. It follows a young man through his life who, as a child, is sexually abused by his household staff, and then that shapes his personality as he grows up, so he believes he's incapable of feeling emotions, and he uses people, and he goes down a spiral of addiction, and it's just the most depressing story you could ever read in your entire life. But it was very moving in a lot of ways. Like it made me feel uncomfortable and upset, and it made me think a lot about the choices that I've made in my life, and if I could do things differently, would I, and how do I view the world and how do I view other people? And also, because Junji Ito illustrated this, the art is, as always, absolutely phenomenal. Like, it just, everything that he does is a masterpiece, and he has done so well illustrating the mind of this broken man in a way that only a master of horror manga could. I can't speak to how well this manga adapted the original classic classic because I haven't read it, but The Artisan Geek has a really great analysis and breakdown of that I will link below. Absolutely love their channel, and you should definitely check it out. Like I said, this is a very, very dark book, and again, like most of the books I ended up reading this month, there are a lot of trigger warnings for this, so I would not recommend this book to someone who is not accustomed to reading some very uncomfortable and very graphic novels that deal with some very, very dark personal struggles. That being said, I really enjoyed it, if that makes any sense to say about a book like this. It is a story that I will not soon forget. It will stick with me for quite a while. The next book I read was The One by John Marrs, and this was a 4 out of 5 star read for me. This was another thriller. Like I said, I read a lot of thrillers this month, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. This book follows 4 lives that have been touched by this dating app that uses your DNA to match you with your soulmate, the one who you're supposed to spend the rest of your life with. And the pros and cons of a system like that, how this kind of system would work in different circumstances, and the effects of having your soulmate predetermined for you by genetics. I highly recommend going into this book not having read the synopsis, not knowing anything about it other than the fact that it is a thriller that deals with genetically paired soulmates, because there are so many twists and turns and so many plot twists that happen from even early on in the book that are spoiled by descriptions of this book that had a huge impact on my enjoyment, not having known that they were coming, basically. The chapters in this book are extremely short, like 1 or 2 pages at most, and because it is constantly switching perspectives, it was a little bit jarring at first, but every chapter ends on a cliffhanger. Every chapter, it goes hard. Like, it is so fast-paced, so high energy, high octane. I loved this book. It was a great thriller. It was truly thrilling. And I highly recommend this book to anybody who's interested in, if you're even interested at all in the premise of it, please pick this up. The next book I read was The Regrets by Amy Bonifants, and this was a 2 out of 5 star. I didn't really enjoy this book. The premise of this book is super interesting, but the execution was not even there. This book follows a boy who dies, basically, and comes back as a ghost due to a clerical error in the afterlife. And he meets a girl at a bus stop and they fall in love. But he's not allowed to have any lasting contact with people who are alive, lest he incur regrets and become trapped on Earth, unable to move on. So, super interesting premise, right? This could have been this amazing love story, this heartbreaking tragedy, this very poignant exploration of forbidden love and life and death and things like that. Instead, we got this. We got the horniest ghost story you will ever read. It is borderline unbearable, to be honest. And it's not well done. It is so forced. It's just the author wanting to write a novel about a bunch of people getting it on, but not wanting to write erotica, basically. There is, towards the end, the only reason it's not 1 star is 1, it's not really inherently problematic, it's just the exact opposite kind of book that I enjoy to read, but 2, it does have like a lot to say towards the end of the book. I won't spoil it, but the outcome of this relationship between the ghost and the person who was alive, I thought it was really well done. I thought that was handled really well. That being said, there was almost no plot in this. It's just them fucking. So 2 out of 5 stars. The cover's cute, but other than that, it brings nothing to the table. The next book I read was Voyage for Madmen by Peter Nichols, and this was also a 2 out of 5 stars. Wow, I really don't have a good track record with nonfiction this year. This is a nonfiction that follows the 6 sailors who set off to do the Golden Globe single-handed race to sail around the world from England back all the way to England, and each of their individual journeys Only one person in the race actually finished. That is like, you know that from the beginning. That's not a spoiler. And so it's what happened to all of them over the course of the year that they were sailing. The first couple of chapters of this book felt like an attempt to write a history lesson about the history of sailing, basically, but it wasn't actually very informative. It just said some stuff about sailing races and then was like, oh yeah, also these guys are doing this other thing in the 60s. And also, I don't think this is a very accessible book to anybody who doesn't have a prior knowledge of sailing. It's very clearly written for people who are interested in either single-handed racing or single-handed sailing journeys. That wasn't as much a problem for me because I've grown up sailing on the Chesapeake Bay around where I live. So I have some real prior knowledge of sailing and different terminology and what boats look like and how sailing works as a sport, because I've gone on sailing races before, but it is not a book that's accessible to anybody who doesn't have that experience. And it's not really an adventure novel either. It's just sort of a transcription of the logbooks that these 5 sailors had, and it really doesn't become about the race itself until much, much later in the book. So not great, not a good book, not a bad book, but there definitely is an audience for this. It has like a crazy high rating on Goodreads, like a 4.2 or something. So that leads me to believe that the people who are picking up this book are the people that this book is very clearly written for. So I wouldn't really recommend this to anybody who isn't previously interested in specifically sailing books. The next book I read was This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki, and this was a 3 out of 5 star for me. This is a graphic novel that follows 2 teen girls who spend one summer at a lake house in this coastal town, and it's just everything that happens to them during the summer. It's very, 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 very sad. I will say that. This is not a like fun, lighthearted YA. This is not anything but a very gritty and realistic look at 2 teen girls struggling with being teen girls and growing up and coming to terms with the fact that the world is changing just as they are changing. And it is very realistic in its depiction of growing up to the point where it was very heartbreaking for me to read. I don't know, I'm torn between saying that this was too sad to be good and saying that it was so sad it was a masterpiece. So I did end up settling on a 3 out of 5 stars. It deals with a lot of heavy topics. Underage drinking, suicide, teen pregnancy, body image issues, marriage issues between parents, sexuality, budding sexuality, puberty, things like that. It's very heavy for a graphic novel. For a YA graphic novel, I should say. I would recommend this, I have to say. I would really recommend this to teen girls. I would not recommend this to anybody beyond that age demographic, because as a teen girl, you would probably get more out of this than just feeling bad. We're gonna try that again because my camera stopped recording. The next book I read was Stacy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and this was a 5 out of 5 star book. This was phenomenal. I adored this. If you have not heard about this book, I'm sure you have. I'm sure you already know what this is about. But this is a series of interviews with the members of the biggest fictional band in the 1960s and 70s, chronicling their getting together as a band and then their inevitable and eventual breakup in 1979. That's not a spoiler, that's first page kind of stuff. It's a biography of each member's life, basically, leading up to that, how they got together as a band, what their lives were outside the band, how the dynamics of the people within the band grew and changed as time went on, and how Daisy Jones as a person grew, changed, and also changed the people around her. I also listened to the audiobook, which I highly recommend. It was so well done. It was a full cast, and oh my god, the way that Taylor Jenkins Reid writes characters, you feel like they're real people. It was fucking amazing. And I found myself wanting to Google Daisy Jones and the Six, wanting to Google the bands that they worked with, the songs that they wrote, the things that were, the people, the celebrities that were mentioned, to try to learn more about just side characters that were mentioned on one-offs. And nothing in this is real. No matter how real it feels, none of this is entirely fiction, which is a gift that Taylor Jenkins Reid has. And I'm so excited to pick up The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo after this. I have to say, if you haven't picked this up because you're not interested in historical fiction, it doesn't feel like historical fiction. It feels like a love letter to what made the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. It is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It is so sad and so uplifting and just so fun. It was a fun read, and I highly, 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 highly recommend it. Again, super excited to pick up Evelyn Hugo after this, and I feel like everybody needs to read this book. It was so great. The next book I read was Big Little Lies by Liam Moriarty, and this was a 4 out of 5 star read for me. This book basically follows a young single mother who moves into this very wealthy, very elite coastal town in Australia, and sends her son to this very quote-unquote prestigious but also very cliquey kindergarten in that coastal town. And the mothers of the kindergarten students are so messed up. It's rich white women doing rich white women stuff, but it's also about murder, about lies, about infidelity, about domestic violence, about what it means to be a woman in the context of, you know, wealth and power and motherhood, being a wife, being a friend. I had no idea I was going to enjoy this book as much as I did at all. I just bought it on Book Outlet on a whim. Oh my, I was just drawn in from the very beginning. Like I said, most of the books that I've read this month were very, very dark. Again, a lot of trigger warnings for this, especially domestic violence. There is a huge portion of this book dedicated to that. So be, again, very wary going in if that would be a problem for you. Even if you don't think you're going to like domestic thrillers, I recommend picking this up because it does not feel like a domestic thriller at all. It feels more like a murder mystery / feminist commentary of, again, what it means to be a wife, a mother, and a friend. The second to last book I read in March was My Plain Jane by the Lady Jadies. Again, Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jody Meadows. And this is the sequel to My Lady Jane, which I read earlier in the month. This was a 3 out of 5 stars, so a little bit disappointing in the face of the 5 out of 5 that My Lady Jane was, and it really kind of fell flat, especially so soon off the heels of reading that book. Like I mentioned earlier, each book in this series is a standalone retelling of a famous Jane in history or literature, with a supernatural twist, and this one was a Jane Eyre retelling with ghosts added. This one just didn't have the humor or the action or the romance that the first novel in the series did. Every element of the original Jane Eyre story that was included in this felt very shoehorned into the story that the Lady Janies had planned to tell, I feel. I feel like they had a plot in mind, this secret society of ghost hunters in London, and the elements of the original Jane Eyre story that they chose to include didn't quite mesh well with that original plot. And the characters were not as lovable as they were in the original novel. There was no character that I felt really connected to or that I really wanted to root for at all in this novel, except maybe, I take that back. There's only one out of all the characters in this book that I really wanted to root for, and she was a side character. It wasn't even the main character. And I think the Jane in this novel, Jane Eyre, she was so insufferable in a lot of ways. There was almost no build up to her romance with Mr. Rochester, and it just sort of came and went out of nowhere in the first 150 pages. That was swept under the rug, like, haha, she's in love with Mr. Rochester. What a fool. What a boy-obsessed little ditz. And I don't know, it just didn't sit right with me. Like I said, it fell really, really flat in the face of what was such a great first novel. I still enjoyed it, I finished it, and I'll still be picking up the third book in the series when it comes out, My Calamity Jane, which I think is coming out in June. But I was really disappointed. I was really bummed out by this book. And the final book I read in March was The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, and I didn't rate this book because I don't rate books that I read for school. I'm not going to spend too long talking about it because Again, it was a book for school, but I will say that this was a very, very heavy, very, very hard book to get through, not because it was, lofty or anything, but because of the themes that it deals with. As much as I love the way that Toni Morrison writes, if you're not assigned this in school, I would not recommend reading it. It is beautifully written, but it is very, 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 very hard to read. Glad I read it. Probably won't reread it. So that is it. 18 books in March. I still can't believe I read that many books, and I am hoping I can get as much done in April, but I'm not going to beat myself up if I don't. It was an amazing reading month for me. I had some really great books that I read. So many 4- and 5-star books that I just really enjoyed. So I'm going to count March as my most successful reading month of the year so far. And I don't know, I just had a really good time with it. So thank you so much for watching. Hopefully I'll have another video up for you soon. Like I mentioned in my reading vlog, a comparison between the Chalk Man, the Whisper Man, and the Chestnut Man, as well as a reading vlog of me reading the whole Grishaverse trilogy in like a single span of time, and my thoughts on that as it goes along. So a lot of things that I'm excited to try, a lot of things I'm excited to do. I've already finished one book for April and started my second, so we're doing great on that too. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, smash that bell, do what you do on the YouTubes, and I'll see you guys in the next one.